Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. For today's topic, I'll be discussing the sources you can use to give yourself ideas and inspiration when you're designing a new setting. After all, while the bolt from the blue concept sounds like a great and easy way to get inspired, the fact is that every new idea has to build on something else, something that already exists. So the real best way to create a unique setting is to draw from as many existing sources as you can get your hands on. Number 1. Reread your favorite authors. This is the most obvious way to find ideas you'd want to add to a new setting. Which authors and other creators produce works that you enjoy the most? Which ones do you most respect, or admire, or love? And don't just limit yourself to speculative fiction creators, because even authors of non-genre fiction and non-fiction can make you think about the way people live, how people interact with each other, and how politics and religion have changed, both recently and in past centuries. Also, if you have one author or other creator whose works you love far and away more than anyone else's, you should still be sure to consume a variety of works, even if they aren't all your favorites. When you focus on emulating one creator, your works are very likely to become nothing more than a pale imitation of theirs. However, when you draw ideas from a wider set of authors, you give yourself more options when you come up with setting details, and so you can more easily find a unique voice that can stand independent of all of the authors who influenced you. Number 2. Become a student of history. When you design a setting, it doesn't matter what time period you start out with, the political and cultural landscape will be different from how it is right now in real life. And if you want these changes to be interesting and realistic, it helps to research what life was really like in other times and places. For a historical setting, you should obviously research what your setting's period was like, but then you can also take things one step further and look at how and why earlier periods evolved into the period you're aiming for. If the setup is different in your setting, then the outcome could also change, and that can give you an opportunity to make your setting much more interesting and divergent from our reality. Something else you pick up when you study a lot of history is broad patterns of human behavior. Nations often move through certain cycles throughout their existence, and new technologies are often able to disrupt the status quo in unusual ways. Consider the link between printing presses and the Protestant Reformation, or the way steam engines accelerated urbanization. Looking back at these cycles and technologies and movements can give you an idea of how the world might change when you introduce something new, like functional magic or a future technology. Number 3. Hunt down unusual reference materials. Another way to make your setting stand out is to start with an offbeat reference book, instead of building directly off a pre-existing speculative fiction setting. For instance, you could find a book that records myths and fairy tales from a lesser-known culture like Polynesian, Incan, or East African. You could read through a real-life book of magic like the Lesser Key of Solomon, or you could study a tarot deck. Or maybe you could find a medieval or Renaissance-era travelogue or bestiary and use the cultures and creatures they make up as a starting point for a region in your setting. You can also use contemporary references for inspiration. The tabloids that aren't based around celebrities come up with some very unusual stories. And the whole world is full of urban legends and modern mythological monsters like Bigfoot and the Jersey Devil. There are also non-scientific theories out there like sunken continents, flat earth theories, aquatic ape theories, and so on. These ideas might not be accurate or even peer-reviewed in our reality, but then what if they are true in the setting you invent? You could even add a conspiracy theory to your setting that has people wondering if their flat earth is secretly round. Number 4. Consume popular science stories. A lot of science fiction authors read popular science stories or otherwise keep up with scientific advancements because every new theory or study or discovery could be the basis for a story. And while this source is more obvious for science fiction stories, you can also use information like this to give you ideas for a fantasy setting. Archaeologists are constantly discovering new information about older time periods and how people lived back then, And if you want to use a hard magic system that has rules based on physics or chemistry, then it definitely helps to understand those scientific fields before you get started. Number 5. Read RPG setting books. Even if you aren't a fan of role-playing games, you can learn a lot about creating a setting by reading the setting material for just about any popular tabletop RPG. Games like these create settings so that their players can use them as backdrops for stories, and that means they go into a lot more detail about their settings than what you usually find in a novel or a short story. And since RPGs almost always take place in a speculative fiction setting, all of that information can be a great source of inspiration and research when you're creating your own setting. For instance, Dungeons & Dragons offers a variety of settings that start with traditional medieval fantasy and then also include Industrial Revolution fantasy, a world city setting, and a Greek legend setting, and that's just counting the current edition. If you dig through older D&D books, you'll find a fantasy spaceflight setting, a multiverse setting, a post-apocalypse setting, a gothic horror setting, and even more. Other RPGs I'd recommend for their setting details include Vampire the Masquerade, Shadowrun, Cyberpunk, Eclipse Phase, and RuneQuest. Now the books can be surprisingly expensive, and some older material isn't even in print anymore, but you can find resources online that can fill you in, including both PDF files and useful wiki sites. Number 6. Build on your existing stories. Not everyone starts writing by creating a setting, and if that's the case with you, then maybe you've already got a few stories lying around that you can build on. Maybe they all take place in the same setting, an idea that can have some very interesting implications depending on how closely connected they are. Or maybe you came up with a character or a place in a short story, and now you want to build some extra context around them so that you can tell more of their stories. A lot of authors go this route. Tolkien originally wrote The Hobbit as a side project, but he loved the characters he created so much that he incorporated them into the bigger setting he was making. Asimov wrote the robot short stories, robot novels, and Foundation novels as standalone works originally, but later on he wrote some sequel novels that stitched them all together into a single timeline. Harlan Ellison, in a rather unusual example, used a video game tie-in to his short story I Have No Mouth But I Must Scream to expand on the backstory both of the human protagonists and of the world as a whole. And while going over old stories might be hard for some authors, you'll be surprised by the ideas you can dig out of them. Number 7. Refine your old ideas. Aside from rereading your old stories, you should also consider going back and looking at any old setting notes you may have written down, or old story ideas that never got fleshed out. A lot of people come up with interesting ideas for settings and stories even as kids, and while these ideas often involve a lot of crude humor, power fantasies, and wish fulfillment, you can find little nuggets of interest that may have slipped out of your head in the intervening years. And even if all of your old material is worthless, you can still use its existence to inspire you to try again, but to do it better next time. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.